I still remember the exact words the security guard said to me that morning because they did not make any sense at all. "Ma'am, I am sorry, but you are not authorized to see the baby." For a moment I honestly thought he had made a mistake. I stood there holding a bouquet of blue flowers I had picked up on the way to the hospital, staring at him like I had misheard something. My grandson had been born just a few hours earlier, and all I wanted was to see him for the first time. "My name is Margaret Lawson, I am 62 years old, and I had driven almost 40 minutes across Chicago that morning the moment my son Daniel called to say his wife Emily had delivered a healthy baby boy. The sun had barely come up when I left my house, and the streets were still quiet except for the early commuters. I remember feeling nervous and excited the whole drive, the way a grandmother does when she knows her family is about to grow. I kept imagining what the baby might look like. Would he have Daniel's dark hair or Emily's bright smile? I even stopped at a small flower shop near the hospital to buy something cheerful for Emily, because I knew the first hours after birth could be exhausting and emotional. By the time I walked through the main doors of the hospital, my heart was pounding with excitement. Everything inside smelled like fresh coffee and disinfectant, and the lobby was already busy with people moving through the hallways. I asked the receptionist where the maternity ward was, and she pointed me toward a quiet elevator at the end of the corridor. I remember smiling the entire way up to the third floor, holding the flowers carefully so I would not bend the stems. But the moment the elevator doors opened, everything changed. At the entrance to the maternity wing there was a security desk with a guard sitting behind a computer screen. He looked polite but serious as he asked me to sign in before entering. That seemed normal enough, so I gave him my name and told him proudly that my grandson had been born early that morning. The guard nodded and began typing something into his system. I expected him to hand me a visitor badge and wave me through. Instead he frowned slightly and looked at the monitor again as if checking something twice. Then he looked back at me with an awkward expression that made my stomach tighten. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you Margaret Lawson?" I told him yes, of course I was. He took a slow breath and then said the sentence that still echoes in my mind. "I am sorry, but you are not authorized to see the baby." I blinked at him, confused, certain there had been a mistake somewhere in the system. I explained that my son Daniel Lawson was the father and that I had just spoken to him on the phone a couple of hours earlier. The guard nodded politely but did not move from his chair. He turned the screen slightly so he could read from it and said something that made the situation even more unbelievable. According to the visitor list, the only people authorized to enter the room were Emily's parents. For a moment the hallway felt strangely quiet around me. Nurses walked past, carts rolled down the corridor, and somewhere nearby I could hear the soft cry of a newborn baby, but all I could focus on was the guard's words repeating in my mind. My daughter-in-law had allowed her own parents inside to see the baby. But somehow I was not on the list at all. I stood there holding the flowers in my hands, suddenly unsure what I was supposed to do next. I stood there for several seconds without moving because my mind was still trying to process what the guard had just told me. It felt like there had to be some kind of misunderstanding. I had been waiting months to meet my grandson, and the idea that I was somehow not allowed to see him did not make sense. I forced a polite smile and leaned a little closer to the desk, trying to keep my voice calm. I told the guard again that I was the baby's grandmother and that my son Daniel Lawson was the father. I even pointed toward the hallway behind him and explained that my son had called me early that morning to say the baby had arrived. The guard listened patiently and nodded, but his expression did not change. He looked back at the computer screen in front of him and gently tapped a few keys, almost as if he hoped the information might change the second time he checked it. After a moment he turned the monitor slightly toward me and spoke in the careful tone people use when they know a conversation might become uncomfortable. He said that according to the hospital visitor authorization list, only 2 names had been approved for entry into the room besides the parents. Those 2 names were Robert Carter and Linda Carter, Emily's parents. My name was not on the list anywhere. Hearing those words made my chest feel strangely tight. I had always believed that when a baby is born, both sides of the family come together to celebrate. Yet at that moment I was standing outside the maternity wing while someone else's names were written clearly where mine should have been. I tried to laugh a little and told the guard that there must have been a mistake. I explained that Emily and I had always been polite with each other and that there was no reason she would block me from seeing the baby. The guard gave me a sympathetic look and said he understood, but the hospital had strict rules about newborn security. He could only allow visitors whose names had been authorized directly by the patient. I glanced down at the flowers in my hands and suddenly felt very out of place standing there in the hallway. Around me people continued walking in and out of the maternity area. A young couple passed through the doors laughing softly while carrying a small bag of gifts. A nurse pushed a cart down the corridor, smiling as she greeted another family waiting nearby. Life inside that hallway was moving forward like any other happy day in the maternity ward, but somehow I felt as if I had been paused outside of it. I pulled my phone out of my purse and decided the easiest solution was to call Daniel. Surely he could clear this up in seconds. I tapped his name in my contacts and held the phone to my ear while the line rang. One ring passed, then another, then another. Eventually the call went to voicemail. I tried again, thinking he might simply be busy with the baby or talking with a nurse. The second call rang even longer before ending the same way. I lowered the phone slowly and looked back at the guard, who gave me a quiet apologetic shrug as if he wished the situation were easier. I took a seat in one of the chairs near the wall just outside the secured doors, still holding the bouquet of blue flowers on my lap. For the first time that morning a strange thought crossed my mind, a thought I did not want to believe but could not completely ignore. What if Emily had really chosen not to include me? I sat quietly in the chair outside the maternity wing for several minutes, trying to convince myself that there had to be a simple explanation for what was happening. Hospitals were busy places, and mistakes could happen. Maybe Emily had been asked to list visitors quickly after the delivery and simply forgot to include my name. Maybe the nurse had entered something incorrectly into the system. The more I thought about it, the more I tried to believe it was just a small misunderstanding that Daniel would fix the moment he saw his phone. But as the minutes slowly passed, that explanation began to feel less certain. I looked down at my phone again and decided to send Daniel a message instead of calling for the third time. I typed carefully, telling him that I was at the maternity desk but the security guard said my name was not authorized to enter. I added a small smile at the end of the message because I did not want him to think I was upset. I told him it was probably just a mix-up and asked him to check with Emily when he had a moment. After sending the message, I placed the phone back in my lap and looked around the hallway again. A young woman sitting a few chairs away from me was talking excitedly on the phone, telling someone that her sister had just had a baby girl. A man carrying a stuffed animal walked past the security desk and was waved inside after the guard checked his badge. Each time the doors opened for someone else, I could see a glimpse of the quiet maternity corridor beyond them, and I felt the strange distance between myself and the moment I had been waiting for all morning. I kept remembering the sound of Daniel's voice on the phone earlier that day when he told me the baby had arrived. He had sounded tired but happy, the way new fathers often do. He told me that Emily and the baby were both healthy and that everything had gone well. I could still hear the pride in his voice when he said, "Mom, you are officially a grandmother." That was the moment I had grabbed my keys and headed out the door without even finishing my coffee. As I sat there replaying that conversation in my mind, another thought slowly surfaced, one that made me uncomfortable because it forced me to remember a conversation Emily and I had months earlier. It had not been a fight exactly, but it had been one of those moments where two people walk away feeling as though something had not been fully understood. I had visited Daniel and Emily one Sunday afternoon shortly after they announced the pregnancy. We were sitting in their living room talking about the future, about baby names and nursery colors and all the small details that come with preparing for a new child. At one point Emily had mentioned that she hoped the first few weeks after the birth would be quiet so she could adjust to being a new mother. I remember telling her that I completely understood and that I did not want to intrude on their space. I had said something like, do not worry about me rushing over right away. You two should enjoy your time together first. At the time I believed I was being respectful and considerate. But sitting there in that hospital hallway, I suddenly wondered if Emily might have heard something very different in my words. I wondered if she had interpreted my attempt to give them space as a sign that I did not care about being there. Just as that thought crossed my mind, my phone vibrated softly in my hand. My heart jumped as I looked down and saw Daniel's name on the screen. The moment I saw Daniel's name on my phone screen, my heart immediately lifted because I believed everything was about to be fixed. I answered the call quickly, trying to sound calm even though my nerves had been building for the past 20 minutes. Daniel's voice came through the phone sounding slightly tired but still warm and familiar. He asked me where I was, and I told him I was sitting just outside the maternity wing near the security desk. For a brief second there was silence on the line, the kind of pause that makes you realize something unexpected is happening on the other side of the conversation. Then Daniel asked a question that completely caught me off guard. He asked why I was sitting outside instead of coming to the room. I explained that the security guard had stopped me because my name was not listed as an authorized visitor. I told him that the list apparently only included Emily's parents. Daniel sounded genuinely confused when he heard that. He said he had no idea there was any kind of restriction like that, and he certainly did not remember anyone mentioning that my name should not be included. I could hear the faint sound of hospital activity in the background of his call, voices and equipment moving somewhere nearby, which made me realize he was probably still inside the room with Emily and the baby. Daniel told me to wait where I was and said he would come out to the desk immediately to figure out what had happened. After we ended the call, I sat there again, this time with a mixture of relief and nervous curiosity. I believed that within a few minutes Daniel would walk down the hallway, talk to the guard, and everything would be sorted out. While I waited, I watched the elevator doors open and close at the end of the corridor as visitors arrived and others left the maternity floor. Time moved slowly in those quiet hospital minutes. Eventually the elevator opened again and I saw Daniel step out into the hallway. The moment he spotted me sitting in the chair, he walked toward me quickly with a surprised expression on his face. He looked exhausted the way new fathers often do after a long night at the hospital, but his eyes lit up when he reached me. He gave me a quick hug and said he had been wondering why I had not come in yet. I showed him the flowers still resting in my lap and explained again what the security guard had told me earlier. Daniel turned toward the desk and spoke with the guard for a moment while I stayed seated nearby. The guard remained polite and professional as he repeated the same information he had already shown me. The visitor list had been entered directly by the patient, and only 2 additional visitors had been approved beyond the parents. Those names were Emily's mother and father. Daniel listened carefully and then asked if there had been any mistake or delay in the system. The guard shook his head and said the list had not changed since it was submitted that morning. Daniel thanked him and then turned back toward me with a puzzled look that clearly showed he was trying to make sense of the situation. He told me that he needed to go back inside and speak with Emily because he had never heard her say anything about limiting visitors like that. As he started to walk back toward the secure doors, he paused and gave me a reassuring smile. He told me not to worry and said he would be right back after talking to her. I watched as he disappeared through the doors into the maternity hallway, leaving me once again sitting outside the entrance holding a bouquet of flowers and wondering what Emily was going to say. I remained seated in the chair outside the maternity wing after Daniel disappeared through the secured doors, and for the first time that morning the excitement I had felt earlier began to settle into a quiet sense of uncertainty. I placed the bouquet of flowers gently beside me and folded my hands together while I waited, trying to focus on the reassuring smile Daniel had given me before he walked away. He had sounded confident that the situation would be sorted out quickly, and I wanted to believe that in just a few minutes he would return and wave me inside. Still, the silence of the hallway made every passing minute feel longer than it probably was. Nurses moved back and forth behind the desk, speaking softly with one another while checking charts and computer screens. Occasionally the doors to the maternity wing opened when another authorized visitor entered or left, and each time they did I instinctively glanced up, hoping to see Daniel returning. As I sat there I could not help thinking again about the conversation Emily and I had months earlier in their living room. At the time I had believed I was being respectful by telling her that she and Daniel should have space after the baby arrived. I had wanted to show her that I understood how overwhelming those first days could be for a new mother. But now I wondered if my words might have sounded distant instead of supportive. I wondered if she had interpreted my attempt at politeness as a lack of interest in being part of their moment. That thought sat heavily in my mind as I waited. After what felt like nearly 15 minutes, the secure doors finally opened again and Daniel stepped back into the hallway. I immediately noticed that his expression had changed. He was not upset, but he looked thoughtful in a way that told me he had just had a serious conversation. He walked toward me slowly and pulled the chair next to mine a little closer before sitting down. For a second he rubbed his hands together as if trying to organize his thoughts before speaking. Then he looked at me and said something that made my heart sink slightly. He told me that Emily was surprised when he mentioned I was waiting outside the maternity desk. According to her, she had believed that I did not plan to come to the hospital right away. I felt a quiet wave of confusion move through me because that was not true at all. Daniel explained that when Emily was asked earlier that morning to list visitors, she remembered the conversation we had months ago when I said I did not want to rush over after the baby was born. She had interpreted those words to mean that I preferred to give them space for the first day or two. Because of that, she had only listed her parents as visitors, assuming I would come later once the family had settled. Hearing that explanation left me sitting silently for a moment while everything slowly began to make sense. I realized that the misunderstanding had not come from anger or rejection, but from a simple difference in how our earlier conversation had been understood. Daniel looked at me carefully and said that Emily felt embarrassed when she realized I had been sitting outside waiting to come in. He told me she had asked him to come back and explain what happened before changing the visitor list with the nurse. As I listened to him, the tension I had been holding in my chest all morning slowly began to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of relief that the situation was not what I had feared. For a moment neither Daniel nor I spoke as we sat in those chairs outside the maternity doors, both of us quietly processing how a simple conversation from months earlier had turned into such a confusing situation. I took a slow breath and looked down at the bouquet of blue flowers resting beside me, realizing that the entire morning had unfolded because two people had tried to be considerate but had misunderstood each other. Daniel finally broke the silence by giving a small, relieved smile and explaining that Emily truly believed she was respecting my wishes. He told me that when the nurse asked her to list the visitors earlier that morning, she remembered my words about not wanting to rush over right after the baby arrived. In her mind, she thought she was giving me the quiet time I had asked for. Daniel said that when he told her I had been sitting outside the maternity desk holding flowers and waiting to meet the baby, Emily immediately felt terrible. She had apparently looked at him with surprise and asked why I had not come in sooner. When Daniel explained that the security desk had stopped me because my name was not authorized, Emily realized the misunderstanding instantly. Daniel told me she had already asked the nurse to update the visitor list so that I could come inside. Hearing that made a wave of relief pass through me so strongly that I had to laugh softly at myself. Just a short time earlier I had been sitting in that same chair wondering if Emily did not want me there at all, and now it turned out that she had simply believed she was honoring something I had said months ago. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand gently and said that Emily also wanted him to tell me something else. She wanted to apologize for the confusion and hoped I understood that the last thing she ever intended was to keep me away from the baby. I told Daniel honestly that I understood completely, because the truth was that I could see exactly how the misunderstanding had happened. When I remembered the tone of that conversation in their living room months earlier, I realized I had spoken carefully about giving them space but never actually said that I would not want to be there right away. In my mind those words meant I would wait until they invited me in. In Emily's mind those same words meant I preferred to stay away at the beginning. It was a small difference in interpretation that had grown into something much larger simply because neither of us had clarified it. As Daniel and I finished talking, the security guard at the desk looked over and gave us a polite nod as if he had already received the updated information from the nurses. Daniel stood up and offered me his hand, his expression brighter than before. He told me that everything had been fixed and that Emily was waiting for us inside. I picked up the bouquet of flowers again and stood beside him, suddenly feeling the excitement I had felt earlier that morning return just as strongly as before. Together we walked toward the secure doors of the maternity wing. This time when the guard checked the computer and handed me a visitor badge, he smiled warmly and wished me congratulations. As the doors opened and Daniel led me down the quiet hallway, I realized that in just a few more moments I was finally going to meet my grandson for the very first time. Walking down the quiet maternity hallway beside Daniel felt strangely surreal after everything that had happened during the past hour. Just a short time earlier I had been sitting outside the secured doors wondering if I was even welcome there, and now I was finally walking toward the room where my grandson was waiting. The hallway was calm and softly lit, with the gentle sounds of hospital activity echoing from distant rooms. Nurses passed by carrying charts and small carts of supplies, and each one smiled politely as Daniel and I walked past. I could feel my heart beating faster with every step, not because I was nervous anymore but because the moment I had imagined all morning was finally about to happen. Daniel slowed down as we approached one of the rooms near the end of the corridor. He placed his hand gently on the door handle and looked back at me with a warm expression. In a quiet voice he told me that Emily had been asking if we were coming yet. Hearing that made me smile because it reminded me again that the entire misunderstanding had simply been a matter of crossed expectations. Daniel opened the door slowly and stepped aside so I could walk in first. The room inside was peaceful and filled with soft afternoon light coming through the window. Emily was resting in the hospital bed with a light blanket over her, and beside her was the small clear bassinet where the baby lay sleeping. The moment Emily saw me standing in the doorway her expression changed from surprise to immediate relief. She sat up slightly and placed a hand over her chest as if she had been worried about how our meeting would go. Before I could even say anything she spoke first, her voice gentle but full of sincerity. She said she was so sorry for the confusion and explained again that she truly believed she was respecting the space I had asked for months earlier. I walked closer to the bed and set the bouquet of blue flowers on the table beside her. I told her honestly that I understood completely because I could see how easily our earlier conversation could have been interpreted in two different ways. The tension that had existed between us earlier in the morning seemed to dissolve almost instantly as we spoke. Emily gave a small grateful smile and thanked me for coming so quickly after hearing the news. Then she glanced toward the bassinet beside her and said something that made my heart melt. She said that someone had been waiting patiently to meet his grandmother. Daniel stepped closer to the bassinet and carefully lifted the tiny bundle wrapped in a soft hospital blanket. Even from a few feet away I could see the baby's tiny hands and peaceful face. Daniel turned toward me and gently placed the baby in my arms, guiding my hands so that I held him safely. The moment I looked down at my grandson for the first time, everything else from the morning seemed to fade away. His face was so small and calm, and his little chest moved slowly as he slept without any awareness of the excitement he had already created in the world around him. Emily watched quietly from the bed with a soft smile while Daniel stood beside us. In that simple moment, holding the newest member of our family, the misunderstanding from earlier felt incredibly small compared to the joy of finally being together. I stood there beside Emily's hospital bed holding my grandson carefully in my arms, still trying to absorb the quiet miracle of the moment. The small weight of him felt almost unreal, as if my mind was struggling to understand that this tiny sleeping child was now part of our family. His little fingers curled slightly against the soft blanket, and every now and then he made a small movement that caused Daniel and Emily to watch him with the kind of amazement that only new parents truly understand. I gently rocked him once or twice without even thinking about it, the way I had done many years earlier when Daniel himself had been a newborn. Emily watched me for a few seconds before speaking again, her voice softer now that the tension from earlier had passed. She told me she had been worried that the misunderstanding might have hurt my feelings more than I was letting on. I looked up from the baby and gave her a reassuring smile because I could see that she meant every word she was saying. I told her honestly that the morning had been confusing at first, but now that we understood what had happened it felt much easier to let it go. I explained that sometimes people say things with one intention while someone else hears something completely different. Emily nodded slowly as if that idea made perfect sense to her now. Daniel leaned against the wall near the window, listening to us talk while watching the baby in my arms with a proud expression that never seemed to fade from his face. After a moment Emily laughed quietly and said that becoming parents had already taught them something important in the first few hours of their son's life. She said that communication inside a family could be much more delicate than people often realized. I agreed with her because the entire situation that morning had been created by a single sentence that neither of us had meant in a negative way. I told Emily that when I said I did not want to rush over after the baby was born, my intention had been to give her time to rest and adjust to the new experience. She explained that when she heard those words months earlier, she believed I was politely telling her that I preferred to stay away until they invited me. We both smiled at the strange way that small differences in interpretation can grow into much larger misunderstandings. Daniel stepped closer and gently touched the baby's tiny hand while he slept peacefully in the blanket. He said that despite the confusion earlier, this day had still turned into one of the happiest days of his life. Emily nodded and said she felt exactly the same way. As I continued holding my grandson, I realized how easily the situation could have become something far more painful if Daniel had not come out to talk with me when he did. Instead, we had taken a moment to listen and understand each other. I carefully handed the baby back to Daniel so Emily could hold him again, and as she cradled her son in her arms she looked at me with a warm expression that felt much closer than before. In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the soft afternoon light and the gentle sounds of a newborn sleeping, it felt as though our family had just learned an important lesson about patience, understanding, and the importance of speaking clearly to the people we care about. As the quiet afternoon continued inside the hospital room, I pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, watching Emily gently cradle her newborn son while Daniel stood beside her with one hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed. The baby shifted slightly in the blanket and let out a small sleepy sound that made all three of us pause and smile. It was such a simple moment, yet it carried a kind of peace that made the stressful confusion from earlier that morning feel very far away. Emily looked down at her son and softly said that it still felt unbelievable that just a few hours earlier he had not even been part of the world yet. Daniel nodded slowly and said that everything suddenly felt different, as if the future had become much more real now that they were responsible for someone so small. I listened quietly for a moment before telling them that becoming a parent has a way of changing the way people see time itself. I explained that the days can sometimes feel long, but the years pass more quickly than anyone expects. Daniel laughed gently and said he had already heard that advice many times, but hearing it now felt different because he finally understood what people meant. Emily looked up at me again with a thoughtful expression and said that she was grateful the misunderstanding earlier had not lasted longer than it did. She admitted that for a few minutes she had worried that the situation might create distance inside the family during a time that should have been joyful. I told her honestly that families often grow stronger not because they avoid misunderstandings, but because they learn how to talk through them with patience and respect. Daniel agreed and said that seeing how quickly we were able to clear things up reminded him of something important. He said that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones people almost avoid having. The baby moved again and stretched his tiny fingers, and Emily adjusted the blanket around him carefully while watching his face with quiet amazement. She said that looking at him made her realize how important it was for him to grow up surrounded by people who communicate openly and support each other. I smiled at that and told her that children notice much more than adults sometimes realize, especially when it comes to the way family members treat each other. Daniel pulled another chair beside mine and sat down so the three of us formed a small circle around the bed, our attention focused on the tiny new member of the family who had already brought us together in a new way. After a few minutes Emily gently placed the baby into the clear hospital bassinet beside the bed so he could sleep comfortably. We all watched him quietly for a moment, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. Daniel finally broke the silence by saying that he hoped one day his son would hear the story about the day he was born and the small misunderstanding that almost kept his grandmother from meeting him. Emily smiled warmly and said that when that day came, the story would probably make everyone laugh because it ended in such a positive way. I stood up slowly and looked at both of them, feeling a deep sense of gratitude that the day had turned out the way it did. Earlier that morning I had been standing outside the hospital doors feeling confused and uncertain, but now I was standing inside the room where my grandson slept peacefully only a few feet away. In that moment it felt clear that the real lesson from the day was not about the misunderstanding itself, but about the importance of giving people the chance to explain their intentions before assuming the worst. And as the late afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the hospital window, our small family sat together quietly, knowing that this day would always be remembered not only as the day a child was born, but also as the day we learned how much stronger understanding can make the bonds between us.